Gretchen, welcome to A House for Arts. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Lara. It's great to be here.
So you are the director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program and a distinguished professor who trains students in work at museums. And I know you've also served as consultant to over 200 museums and that you specialize in African American history and art. So tell me first, how do you use your specialty in African American art history to help museums reach more visitors on meaningful ways?
I think as a historian, and I'm a historian, not an art historian, I teach my students how to contextualize art and how to use it to get people really excited about American history and culture. So I would say that I look at it as an art historian, but I also look at it as cultural artifact. And what can we learn about it? What can we learn about ourselves? What can we learn about the artists that produced it? And hopefully to get people really excited about it. I also really like to juxtapose art from the past with contemporary pieces. And I think that gives us a new way of looking and thinking about art.
Yeah. Is there any specific example of that comes to mind for you right away that's been really effective for helping people understand this form of history?
Well, I think you're familiar with Fred Wilson and his work of juxtaposing objects with art pieces. And right now, my students are working on an exhibition about African American mobility. And one of the things that we're looking at is the Amistad Affair, which is the ship that was shipwrecked off the coast of Connecticut in the mid-19th century.
Right, and they made a famous movie off of that in the
Yes.
90s, right? I think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the Amistad was a slave ship that was taken over by the enslaved people, and they wanted to go back to Africa. So we're talking about mobility in the 21st century and 20th century, but we're also comparing it to mobility in the 19th century, and we're using art as well as artifact to do that.
Right. Gretchen, it sounds like you're using exhibitions and museum collections to help people understand the truth, because we've been hearing a lot in the news lately about disinformation and fake news and searching for the truth, in the news and at college campuses. Can you maybe tell us a bit more about how do exhibitions have the power to help us find the truth?
One of the things about museums, I think, that I find so appealing is authenticity. The objects are real, the objects are authentic, and you're looking at this kind of real piece of the past that can help you understand it. We talk to our students about research and how important it is to really dig into that research and not to just look at one single source, but to look at multiple sources and to really question all of those sources and where the information is coming from. So you never just look at one single thing. You're looking at newspapers and magazines. You're looking at artists' statements as well as art. You're looking at artifact, and you're verifying everything that you do.
I want to switch gears a little bit from your museum work to your writing, albeit having to still do with social justice, really. I understand last year you published a book called Driving While Black. So if I have this right, this is a book that analyzes the history of race in the automobile in the U.S., right?
Yes.
Yeah, so how did African Americans use cars as a vehicle, both literally and metaphorically, for social justice in Jim Crow America? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I have to say that you couldn't have the civil rights movement without the automobile. When you think about the number of white Americans and Black Americans that went south during the civil rights movement to participate in marches and demonstrations, they needed places to stay and they needed places to eat. And the variety of businesses that grew up to support African American automobile travelers, whether they were segregated motels, restaurants, hotels, little luncheon spots, all of these places were available to civil rights workers when they went south. The other thing I think that's really important is if you think about the bus boycotts In order to desegregate the buses in various towns in the South, they had to boycott the buses. In order to boycott them, they didn't want people to lose their jobs, to lose their source of income. And so they purchased fleets of automobiles that were used to drive people to work.
Right.
And those automobiles really made it possible for the bus companies to be bankrupted. And that's what desegregated the buses.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I understand too that you worked with Rick Burns, who's Ken Burns' brother, on making a film based off your book, right? Tell us
Yes.
about what's the title of the film, and what was it like working on this?
The film has the same first title as the book, Driving While Black, but the subtitle of the film is Race, Space, and Mobility in America. And Rick is an old friend. I took him. We went to lunch together after we were on a panel for OAH, the Organization of American Historians, and I told him that I had a story idea that I wanted to pitch to him, and I wanted him to look at some pictures. And I pulled out my laptop in a restaurant in Manhattan, and we just started flipping through all of the pictures that I had collected of African Americans and their automobiles. And it was interesting because the hostesses and the waiters and waitresses in the restaurant gathered behind us, and they were looking at the photographs as well.
Wow. So they were all just kind of like watching this whole history unfold in a way.
And that's how we got started. And, I think Rick was a little nervous about doing an African American history topic, thinking, well, maybe it should be a Black filmmaker. And my feeling was he was someone that I knew, and it was really important to me to work with someone that I knew to do this story in particular, because it was so important to me, but also that African Americans need white allies. We need allies and supporters. African American community is only about 13% of the US population. Mm-hmm. So we can't do all of this work ourselves. We need white allies.
Right, absolutely. And bringing forward those important stories through both a book as well as a film format, that's so important.
Yes.
And it's making me think about our current situation, actually. And Gretchen, I'm curious to know, do you think there's anything we can learn both from the book and the film that can help us understand our current situation? If, for instance, do you see any parallels between what African American drivers had to deal with and how they used the automobile 60 years ago and how Black American drivers deal today?
Yeah, I think what the film does and what the book does in more detail is really provide a context for understanding what's happening today. It really shows us where we've been. And one of the things that that the book really talks about is the origin of police departments, because police departments in this country really begin as slave catchers and as people who were working to restrict the movement of both African Americans and Native Americans, depending on what part of the country the police department was established in. And when you understand that, and you really start to see how that tension between African Americans and the police has developed over time. Of course, during the period of segregation, many of the police were not supportive of the civil rights movement, and they were, sicking dogs on people and murdering people as well. So, and letting people out of jail so that they could be recaptured by the Klan. So you can start to see where that animosity and that real fear comes from that we see today in traffic stops.
Yeah, do you think that even police departments today kind of engage in some similar practices as well that restricts the movement and the mobility of many African American men and women?
I think that it's not only the police. I mean, I think Americans have absorbed these ideas about white space and Black space, and that there are spaces that African Americans are not supposed to be in, because you find people, calling the police because they find a young woman sleeping in a dorm, say at Harvard or Yale, and of course she's a student. but they've called the police, or they call the police because there are people, Black people sitting in a Starbucks, and they don't think they should be sitting there, or they call the police, or they murder someone like Ahmed Aubrey, who's running in a white neighborhood because it's perceived to be a space that he shouldn't be in.
Right.
So I think this is not just the police, but I think ordinary citizens are guilty of this as well.
That sounds like many Americans, no matter what profession they're in, no matter what their background, could really benefit from, reading your book and watching the film and learning a bit about this history so that we can all know how to get together and help support each other and really help support the freedom and the mobility of Black Americans today.
Yes, I hope so. And I think it's really an important part of history that we don't teach in schools.
Yeah, absolutely. Gretchen, thank you so much for being on the show. It was such a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.